Welcome to Intangibles, a podcast about the traits, behaviors, and qualities that entrepreneurs can cultivate to help be successful. This podcast is created by Antecedent Ventures, an enterprise-focused seed-stage venture firm in New York City. You can find us at www.antecedent.vc. I'm your host, Steve Berg. This season is brought to you by Denton's Venture Technology Group at dentonsventurebeyond.com. Operating as a boutique within the world's largest law firm, the Venture Technology Group runs with hard-charging tech entrepreneurs to drive growth through strategic business, finance, and legal advice, from Silicon Valley and New York to London, Berlin, Hong Kong, and beyond. Learn more at dentonsventurebeyond.com. Don't adjust your headphones. The sound quality of this particular episode is not as high as in past episodes. The quality of the discussion, however, is every bit as high. With that, I hope you enjoy my discussion with Dr. Saras Sarasvathy. Today's topic is effectual logic. I started out believing that this was critical thinking by another name. But in studying the work of my guest today, I've learned that in the context of entrepreneurship, the effectual logic framework for understanding the creation and growth of new organizations and markets is better adapted and more appropriate than critical thinking for startup founders. As a venture capitalist, I'm always trying to put my finger on the traits that will give my founders a competitive edge and a greater chance of being successful. My guest today is Professor Saras Sarasvathy. Dr. Sarasvathy teaches MBA and doctoral courses in entrepreneurship at the Darden School of Business at the University of Virginia. She also teaches in doctoral programs in Europe, Asia, Latin America, and Africa. She's a leading scholar on the cognitive basis for high-performance entrepreneurship. Her co-authored textbook, Effectual Entrepreneurship, won the gold medal in the 2012 Axiom Business Book Awards. In addition to a master's degree in industrial administration, Dr. Sarasvathy received her PhD in information systems from Carnegie Mellon University. Her thesis on entrepreneurial expertise was supervised by the 1978 Nobel laureate in economics, Dr. Herbert Simon. Welcome, Dr. Sarasvathy. As the originator of the effectual logic framework, there may be no better person on the planet to have this discussion with.
Great to talk to you today, Steve, and looking forward to our conversation.
Fantastic. Let's get started. I have so many questions. The first one is, for the uninitiated into this, please explain better than I did in my intro, effectual logic.
Well, I was very fortunate to go out and study what I call expert entrepreneurs. And expert entrepreneurs are not just successful entrepreneurs. These are people who have been through every possible experience that entrepreneurship can offer you. These are people with 10 years or more starting and running companies, multiple companies, including successes and failures, and each of them had taken at least one company public. So the definition of expertise comes from cognitive science, and there were over 200 studies of experts before I got into this particular academic discipline. And although they had studied everything from very simple things, relatively simple things like chess, to complicated things like scientific discovery and how judges make decisions in complicated cases and things like that, they had never applied the techniques that were developed to study expertise to entrepreneurship. And so I got this opportunity to do that. So I first used the criteria that I gave you to select a bunch of entrepreneurs. There were only 245 people in the world who qualified. I wrote to all of them, and 45 people agreed to participate in the study. And as part of that study, I was able to do an experiment with them. So it was not just interviews or surveys or just stuff based on things that had been written about them. I actually put all of these people through the exact same experiment where I gave them a 17-page problem set of 10 typical decisions that happen in a startup. Now, if you think about people who have built ventures in every possible industry you can imagine and have been through every possible experience entrepreneurship can offer and have also shown that they can perform well in that domain, which means they are experts. Normally, when you go talk to them, if you talk to 20 people, you'll get 20 different stories. And then as a researcher, you can figure out what is it that they have learned. But this method that I used, where I had them all think about exactly the same set of 10 problems, and I had them talk continuously as they worked their way through the 17-page problem set, which had a lot of messy information, the kind of real-world information that we'll have if we were making decisions in the real world. So I had all of them go through exactly the same thing. So I transcribed the tapes, and now I had something where I could compare them across all of their experience. And effectual logic is the result of that study, which since then we have replicated and expanded. And over the last 20 years, there have been hundreds of studies, I think close up 200 studies, and there are several thousand educators who are teaching this stuff as well. So now, what is effectual logic? To put it very briefly and concisely, there were 5 different principles that these entrepreneurs were using when making decisions, whether they were decisions in marketing or finance or hiring or any one of these things. But all of these 5 principles had one thing in common. It's very, very interesting. The thing that they all had in common is this idea that when the future becomes very uncertain, or if you're looking at problems where the future is fundamentally uncertain, and you cannot predict what will happen, you have 2 choices. One choice is to say, let me get better at my predicting, right? And there's a lot of science and management science where we do that. We try to predict how consumers will behave, or how potential employees will behave, or which particular project will end up giving you better risk-adjusted return. So we do a lot of work on trying to predict the future better, and we get better at it every year as well. But these expert entrepreneurs kind of take the opposite view, and what seems to be a little bit more commonsensical view in a way, because they say when the future is really unpredictable, don't try to predict it at all. And the idea is each one of the 5 principles teach you to make decisions about an uncertain future without having to actually predict the future. So if you cannot predict the future, what will you do? And what would be a good framework to think about it? And the answer, it turns out, is you always work with things within your control to co-create the future, to shape it, to make it, rather than trying to find what the future is going to do or predict what will happen in the future and then place a bet. Let me take you very quickly through the 5 principles. So the first principle,
you're making my job very easy.
I know, because I think this one, my memory is kicking in and from last week, and I'm so going over that. Please do feel free to interrupt me if you want to, okay?
This is fantastic.
So let me explain the 5 principles that teach you how to make decisions about an uncertain future without trying to predict it. And yet it allows you to control and shape and influence the future. So the first principle is the bird in hand principle. The bird in hand principle suggests that do not get too tied to specific goals. Instead of starting with goals, just think about what are some means that are readily available to you. What are some things already within your control? And what can you do with the things that are already within your control? So now look at what is your bird in hand and then put that to work. So that is the first principle. Let's assume that you start with that principle and you come up with 2 or 3 different things you could do, 2 or 3 different ventures you could build, or do 2 or 3 different products or services you could offer. So how do you choose between those? So starting with your means, you've come up with a couple of ventures that you can build. And the way you choose your venture is not to worry about how big the upside will be, how large the market will be, and how fast it will grow, and all the kinds of stuff that I'm sure, Steve, you think about as an investor. Instead, these expert entrepreneurs say, go the other direction. Think about what you can afford to lose and what you're willing to lose to try something. So the idea is to keep the downside within your control so that you are able to go and push the upside upward. So that's the second principle, the affordable loss principle. So this is day one. You can do a bird in hand assessment and you can kind of come up with an assessment of what is your affordable loss. And then what do you do? What do you actually do in building the venture? So the first thing you do, and this is something you do all the time, is you start interacting with other people. And every time you interact with other people, what you're trying to do is not to gather information so that you can predict the future and place a bet. Although that's okay, you can gather information too. What you're really trying to do is to talk to all kinds of people and think about what is it going to take to bring them on board. You're going to allow all kinds of people to pitch in with you and think with you and act with you and work with you to shape the future. And this principle is actually called the crazy quilt principle, because unlike in the causal mode of thinking where you're trying to predict the future and place a bet, in this case, since you're not 100% sure what your goal is going to be or what kind of upside you will have, what you're trying to do is to work with whoever wants to work with you. So the self-selection process. So you will have a crazy quilt of different people who are willing to work with you or who are each able to, afford to lose something to work with you, if you will. So you're not pitching them on the upside. You're literally talking to them and asking them if they would like to come on board, and they need to invest no more than they can afford to lose either, right? So you will have this crazy quilt of partnerships that you start beginning to build. And as you can see, throughout this process, all kinds of surprises will come your way, good and bad. And so the fourth principle is the lemonade principle, which says be open to surprises, embrace them, leverage them. So basically when life throws lemons, make lemonade, that's where that principle comes from. And finally, as you do this over time, what you really learn is this overall philosophy, this worldview that you can tackle an uncertain future without having to predict it. You can actually co-create it. In other words, you are not just a passenger on a plane going somewhere into the future. You can actually build the plane. You are the pilot of where it goes. You are able to avoid certain weathers if you want, or you can actually fly into the tornado if you want. But there are many more things that you can do. And by you, I do not mean you as a single entrepreneur. I mean the team of people, the team of stakeholders, the crazy quilt of people who come together. They all begin to understand this idea of shaping the future, not just predicting and placing a bet. So that's I think the closest to the fastest summary of the entire research process and the findings I have ever done.
And I think you boiled it down in the last two sentences where you basically said, look, you guide the process versus try and predict the process, which, immediately to me as an investor, that's a big challenge, right? I mean, from what I understand, entrepreneurs are unique in that they think using this effectual logic process you laid out, whereas people like me, managers, strategists, we use this causal logic.
Yes.
It could be helpful to me as I'm trying to learn, if you could contrast the two types and kind of let me know how I can kind of cross over to that effectual logic process.
That's a tall order. I
Yeah.
can definitely help you contrast the two. That one is easy.
Okay.
So beginning with the name, right? The name comes from cause and effect. So in causal logic, you already pick the effect you want to create, right? So you say, I want to be the largest, market leader in this particular market, or I want to, make $40 million by the time I'm 40 years old. You start with some effective which you want to create, and then you start thinking about how can I actually achieve that goal? How can I actually create that effect or cause that effect to happen? So you're always looking to your goal or the effect you want to create to guide you on what to do. So effectual logic starts with at the other end. It doesn't start with an effect. It actually starts with causes, starts with readily available means. And then it asks, what kind of effects can I create that I would actually want to create, right? So in some ways, goals follow means, if you will. So the word causal and effectual right there, you can see the yin and the yang of it. And of course, you can imagine in building a venture, both of those logics being useful. So on the one hand, you want to think about how do you cross over in order to learn this logic if it doesn't come naturally to you. But I'm not asking you to throw away causal logic entirely as well. However, the expert entrepreneurs have learned through their, in the trenches, trying to build their ventures in the school of hard knocks, if you will, that especially when you want to get started on a venture that will grow and survive and endure, you want to use effectual reasoning to guide you. And along the way, as and when you make a particular commitment to particular stakeholders, then causal logic can kick in because you just committed to a particular goal. So they can work together, but effectual logic still dominates in the early stages. So let's just look at the principles and contrast them very quickly, right? A bird in hand principle, if you're thinking causally, you start with a goal and you think about how to achieve that goal. And you can be very creative in thinking about how to achieve that goal. In effectual logic, you start with your readily available means. You start with who you are, what you know, and whom you know. And you keep creating goals. And along the way, if you see something happen, you're always more careful about thinking about what is within my control and how can I use it at all times, rather than saying, okay, here's a goal I want to achieve, so therefore I need to go get some, resources or something that is not in my bird in hand, right? So you always tied more to your means when you're thinking effectually. You're tied more to your goals when you're thinking causally. In the case of the affordable loss principle, when you think causally, you are always guided by expected return, right? You're trying to project what the risk-adjusted return will be, and you're trying to maximize that. When you think effectually about that, you're always trying to keep your focus on the downside, and you want to keep the downside within your control. So if necessary, you can have multiple failures and you can still get up and fight again. So you want to keep the downside within your control, and the upside is something you're going to go out and push because you believe the future can be co-created. Now let's go to the third, the crazy quilt principle. When you think causally, you're always doing, the market is out there, you're trying to predict what that market is, you do competitive analysis, and you start to try to find what we call a highly productive, fast-growing, large but lonely niche, right? So you're always trying to predict what the market space is going to look like, or what is it looking like today, what competitors are going to do, how technology is going to change, and then that drives who are the people that you want to target, what kind of business do you want to do, and who are the people that you want to target, because once you know what business you're doing, you know what resources you need, and you know who has those resources, and you chase them down and you pitch them and you get them on board. When you're thinking effectually, you're not thinking that way because you don't have a particular idea that you are always trying to push, not a particular goal. So you don't have particular targeted stakeholders. Instead, you talk to anyone and everyone, and every time you talk to them, your means will change and your goals will change every time somebody actually comes on board. Here, you're not only trying to gather information to predict the future, you're actually gathering commitments. The only way someone becomes a stakeholder in the effectual setup, they become part of the crazy quilt, is if they actually put some skin in the game. And whatever skin in the game they put then guides you what the goals of the venture should be, or at least what the next set of goals should be. So again, we are reversing the process. Things within your control and people who are bringing more things within your control help shape the goals of the venture. The goals of the venture do not decide which stakeholders you're going to target and pitch. So on the effectual side, we don't, instead of the normal pitching that we teach on the causal side, we actually teach something called the effectual ask. And we can talk about that a little bit more later. Now for the fourth principle, when you are building something causally, because you have a clear goal, you know what resources you want, you know which stakeholders to target, you don't want surprises, right? Especially you want to avoid, any kind of negative surprises. So there is this attitude of damage control that comes in when anything goes wrong. Whereas on the effectual side, everything, even lemons are welcome. You're always open to surprises and you're always thinking creatively how to include every surprise that comes your way. Not just negative or positive surprises, but even things that are maybe not quite related to the venture that you happen to read in a newspaper or you happen to talk to somebody. So you're always open to new inputs, whether they're directly related or not. You're always open to think creatively with anything that happens in your life and in your venture building. And finally, in the last principle, it's very easy. When you're thinking causally, you're really focusing on how can I best predict the future. And I might have some backup plans for things that might happen beyond the prediction, because no prediction is 100%. So you might have a very healthy attitude towards things going wrong, but your aim is to become better at predicting the future and placing careful, calculated bets. On the effectual side, of course, you're never worried about things that are outside your control. In fact, you're open to things outside your control as well, but you're always trying to think about what's within my control, what's not within my control. And your attitude is about building, shaping, influencing, transforming, and making stuff, not about finding answers. It's not a mindset of what I call Genghis Khan. It's not a mindset of, where is the market and how do I, actually capture it? It's not a hunter-gatherer mentality, as in the causal case. In the effectual case, it's very agricultural, right? You really look at the soil, you look at the seeds you have, you look at what is the weather like here, and you start thinking about what can I do with this? What can I plant? And then you think about how can I crossbreed? And you're always thinking more in a creative and co-creative manner.
So for those of us who want to study this a little bit more, do you have any favorite case studies that illustrate the effectuation process?
So let's think about some examples of ventures that have been built using effectual principles. In fact, I would suggest to you, if you know of a venture that for some reason, inspires you or excites you or turns you on for some reason, if you go look at the 0 to 60 miles per hour story, the really early stage history of a company, in most cases, you are going to see effectual principles in action. And we have written up over 200 case histories, everything from Josiah Wedgwood in the 18th century in England to all kinds of tech, non-tech, industrial, medical, all kinds of companies, social ventures, and even some very large organizations that is difficult to even call them a company, like Transparency International. So every one of these ventures, if you go to the very early stage story of how they built, you will see effectual principles in action. For example, one of the most popular stories today is Airbnb. And everybody thinks, oh my God, that's a unicorn. It's a multi-billion-dollar company. They must have been, known that this would be huge, especially when you bring in technology into the idea of just crashing on somebody else's, air mattress. But it did not actually get built that way. There were two young people in San Francisco who just needed a little bit of extra money, and they thought, wouldn't it be nice if somebody would just pay us to sleep on our air mattress? and just to sweeten the pie a little bit, we will make them fresh breakfast in the morning. And I think their idea of fresh breakfast was actually cereal. Anyway, so they started with that. So if you come up with a brilliant idea like that we are going to replace the entire hotel industry where people crash on each other's air mattresses, no venture capitalist is going to take that seriously. So it took them several years, and the story is very interesting. They went to the Democratic National Convention and created these Obama O's and Captain McCain Crunch. That's how they funded themselves in the early stages. And then even though they got into Y Combinator and got a little bit of funding, it was going nowhere until they got on the plane, went to New York City, and they knocked literally, I call this the most important investment for an entrepreneur, which is shoe leather. Right? So they literally knocked on each apartment door in New York City, trying to get people signed up on the platform. And in the process, they realized that photography was very, very important. And they ended up building a very successful photographic platform, a platform for photographers. It is after that Airbnb actually took off. So it took a long time. So these kind of brilliant, enduring ventures do not, happen overnight, and nobody thinks it's the most brilliant idea. I always talk about Google as well. Like Google was the 65th search engine. I was at Carnegie Mellon at the time, and everybody was placing their bet on Lycos. The Lycos raised $40 million. I mean, Google could not raise anything except for some angel investor that the founder's professor introduced them to, and they got like $100,000, and they wanted to sell the company for like $1 million. That was their big dream. So I can go on and on about these examples, but let's look a little deeper and look at how each of these principles can play into a more traditional company, right? We are always going to the valley and talking about unicorns, but there are other ways to build enduring billion-dollar companies. And so one of my favorite ones is Nine Dragon Paper from China, where Mrs. Chang, who was working in an import-export company, basically started noticing that China was importing more and more paper. And when she looked into it, she found it was because China was just coming into the big manufacturing era, and they were manufacturing all kinds of stuff for people around the world, and they were shipping them in cardboard cartons, and they needed paper to make the cartons. And especially, she also noticed that there were lots and lots of small manufacturers in China, and they all had to pay big bucks to get this imported paper and the cartons made of these imported paper. And she started asking herself a very obvious question. This is where I want you to notice that you can just work with things within your control already. You don't have to have the most brilliant idea to start. She had the most obvious idea, which is she asked, like, what happened to these cartons that we sending them? And she found a lot of them just going to the US. And so she started thinking, what happens to the cartons once they reach the US and people take out the product? And we all know what happens, which is basically, we just throw them away and they go into trash dumps, basically. And so she thought, if I can get it back to China. And now, how do you get it back to China for affordable loss? And again, as a person in the import-export industry, she noticed that a lot of the shipping containers were actually coming back empty to China because the US is not exporting anything to China. And so she just made a deal with these container people who are bringing them back empty and saying, what have you got to lose by bringing me a shipload of used cardboard cartons back? And the answer is nothing, right? And if it works out, they could do something together. They could make a deal on the upside. But the idea is to keep the downside within your control. And so she had very little money, but she used the money to actually come to the US because she had made a deal. She knew how to get the cartons back to China. But she needed to actually source the material. She comes to the US. And then, of course, this wonderful surprise is waiting for her that people who are running landfills and big dumps, they were willing to pay her if she would take away a shipping container load full of used cardboard containers. And so she was actually, cash flow positive. at that point, even though she had come fully ready to pay for a shipping container loan. And then, of course, she has to actually get it manufactured in China. And the manufacturing in China is not that difficult because there are lots of manufacturers. And again, as an part of an import-export outfit, she knew these small and medium-sized manufacturers who could use cheaper packing material. They could not afford to import, a container load of fresh cartons to use. Some of the larger manufacturers would do that, but not the SMEs. And so she worked with the SMEs to put together enough number of people so that she could build the first recycling plant. Basically, a crazy quilt of people who said, okay, we'll put in a little bit. And so you don't have to raise enormous amounts of money to do it. And so you can see this multi-billion-dollar company. She's one of the richest women in the world, actually, now. Built this company, an old-style company that you would normally think would require a whole bunch of investment upfront. In fact, if you did this in an MBA class, people would come up with a nice business plan that would require, $1 million or $2 million to get this done. And she got it done for less than the equivalent of $5,000. And I can tell you many, many stories of many companies where people got it done for around $5,000. Another example of mine that I like a lot is Right Now Technologies. Greg Gianforte, sitting in Montana, right, not in the valley, built one of the most successful technology companies. And he used less than $5,000 to do it. Around the time when a very similar company went and raised $90 million in the valley. And then that company was sold for $180,000 later. Whereas Greg built his company, Right Now Technology, starting with less than $5,000. He built it to like $35 million in 4 years and then took it public, and right now still exists and does well. And so think about how did Greg do it? So first of all, in starting this company in Montana, he was not thinking that he's going to build a Silicon Valley unicorn, right? He said, I want to do something in Montana because I like living here. And I want to make this place a little bit more economically stable. I want to create 2,000 jobs. And that was his aim in starting. And he asked himself, okay, what do I know how to do? Well, I know how to write code. And he started looking up what kind of code he can write, and he started calling people that he knew in the industry, and a lot of customer support people. This was a time around which, software as service was just beginning. It was not even a phrase at the time, I believe. But people were talking about it. There was buzz, and he thought, okay, I can do that. So he started asking people, what kind of software should I write for you guys? And people would say, they're looking for this or they're looking for that or something like that. And he had a spec sheet where he would literally tell them, okay, I can deliver this in 90 days. So he only wrote down those specs that he could deliver in 90 days. The things he could not deliver in 90 days, he would just make a note of it and tell people, okay, that I cannot do. And whatever he could deliver, he kept writing it down until enough number of people actually signed on to buy that product with those features that he could deliver in 90 days. And that's the product he built. And he built a product that he had already pre-sold. So he has a beautiful saying. He says, there's only one kind of market research I believe in, he says, and that is sales. And he says nothing happens until somebody sells something. So the idea is before you even have a prototype, you go out and actually sell something. And when you look at all the research from Effectuation and you take that maxim that Greg Gianforte talks about, it turns out that there are very interesting ways to think about that. Of course, nothing happens until you sell something. That is absolutely true in terms of a customer. But sometimes it is a supplier that gets sold. Sometimes it's a competitor that is sold. So if you look at the story of Staples, that's the story where Tom Stemberg's competitor, he was in the grocery chain industry, and he had been, his entire business unit was sold from under him. He basically was fired. And he was thinking what to do. And then he gets a call from his number one competitor, who calls him and says, I have been competing with you for the last 10 years or whatever, Tom. So whatever you want to do next, I'm going to fund you because I've watched you competing. So here is a self-selected stakeholder before Tom Stemberg even has an idea on what he's going to do. And so he says, okay, I got somebody who is going to fund me no matter what I decide to do. So what can I do with what I know? And in the back of his head, he has this idea like, I'll do maybe a specialty grocery chain of some kind. And he said, okay, I'm going to write a business plan because this competitor investor guy was going to come the next week. But over that weekend, he realizes that this is the time of, typewriters. And his Apple typewriter runs out of a ribbon, and he just simply cannot buy ribbon anywhere that weekend. And he says, this is awful, right? And so he throws away whatever idea the specialty grocery chain he was working on. Instead, he decides that I'm going to solve that problem. So on Monday morning, he has no business plan, but he has identified a need, and so it's his competitor who kind of gets him to build the company. And that brings me to one more story. So what I'm trying to get to here is sometimes we don't even need an idea and then have a customer pre-sold, right? It is just any stakeholder who is pre-sold on you can be the starting point for a venture. So I'll give you one more very quick one where again it's a different stakeholder. It's not a customer in the normal sense of the word. So this is the story of Kiran Mazumdar Shah. She's one of the richest women in the world as well, self-made entrepreneur in India. And she had one dream. Her dream was to become a browmeister. And if let me tell you, if you're an Indian woman growing up in India, even if you're from the more westernized, sophisticated, educated family, people are going to think something's wrong with you if that's what you want to do. Anyway, her parents were supportive, and she went to Australia. She was valedictorian of her class, got a job, but began realizing that there is a glass ceiling and there's not much she can do to become a great browmeister as a woman. And disappointed, she comes back to India. And then gets a call from a friend she had met, somebody from Ireland, who basically says, I need to make some, biochemicals. And people told me that I should check out India as a possibility, but I don't know anybody in India except you. Will you make them for me? And she's like, I don't know anything about biochemicals. So then he talks her into it by saying, but you know a lot about enzymes, you know about beer, right? So start by making some enzymes for us. And then she builds this company, Biocon. It's a multi-billion-dollar company. Again, we think normally, I have to come up with this brilliant idea. I have to, what makes the idea brilliant is because I can show there is a large market, a growing market, and then I can show, a certain amount of positive net present value of future cash flows. And then I get Steve Berg on board, venture capital on board, and then I build this company, and then I go public or sell it in 5 to 6 years. Every story I've told you so far did not happen that way. But it did use every single principle that I talked about from Effectuation.
That's what I like the most about these particular, and of course that's probably the reason you told the story, but they all tie back to the effectuation process so kind of cleanly and tightly and perfectly, and illustrate, the 5 principles that you talked about. So that is excellent. A couple of questions come to mind from the examples that you illustrated. I guess it sounds like anyone can learn to use effectual logic.
I do believe that. In fact, I believe if we get away from the standard model of entrepreneurship as these, extraordinary risk takers, over-optimistic people who are willing to throw themselves at a brilliant idea and go after it and make it happen, that's kind of one view of entrepreneurship out there. If we kind of rewind from that, track back from that and start looking at how companies are actually built, we start realizing that there are, learnable, teachable things in this. We talked about the principles, but there are many other things like how do you actually make a sale? How do you manage your cash flow? There's a lot of just basic cooking, if you will, like basic business that you can understand. But the mindset that you can actually do something with them to reshape your own future, to co-create the future of all of humanity, and the entire spectrum in between. That lesson, if you mix it into that, it is possible to learn almost everything of entrepreneurship. In fact, there are two kinds of things I say. One of the things I said, I think I was in Sweden, and I said, any idiot can learn entrepreneurship. And the next day, they put this up on the website saying, University of Virginia professor says any idiot can learn effectual entrepreneurship. And that became like the most visited site in Sweden or something like that. So what I mean by that is you don't need to have a particular set of traits or genius or talent or something, because you can give me any combination of traits or talents or lack thereof, and I can give you examples of people who have built great ventures. The interesting thing there to think about is not that here are a set of traits, and if you have them, you will become a successful entrepreneur, otherwise you will not. That thing is just wrong. What you really want to think about it is, given who I am, right? What I know, whom I know, given the particular traits, the particular preferences, the circumstances, my value system, given that, what kind of great venture can I build? So not everyone can come up with the formula for Facebook, that's not the idea, or the next big thing. But every one of us can build what I call the $20 million company that lasts 20 years and creates 20 jobs. Just for the fun of it, I'm just putting the word 20 in there. I think that is possible. Now, can everybody build a $2 billion company? No, that does not make any sense, right? It is not possible physically to do that, because at the end of the day, to build a multi-billion-dollar company, you have to have hundreds, if not thousands, of employees. And if every single person can do that, then we will have no ventures in the economy. We'll just be back to barter or something. So the idea here is not to create what I call an Einstein in the classroom or a Bill Gates in the classroom. The idea is to teach entrepreneurship the way we teach science. We teach it to everybody, so that everybody comes out with the ability to do it and a mindset of understanding what it takes to do it. And then we end up building an economy and a society capable of fostering entrepreneurship in such a way that we have as many billion-dollar companies as we need and as many as the economy can bear. But we also have as many $20 million, $40 million companies. In fact, I actually think one of the things we want to notice from the history of science is that people talk about science in terms of cures for diseases or technologies that we can use and epidemics that we fight and all those kinds of things. But one of the things that happened along with teaching science to everybody who has an opportunity to go to school is the fact that we built a middle class. Because the mindset that science brought to us is the idea that we do not have to die in the social class in which we are born. That we can actually have knowledge about the universe and we can put it to work so that we can achieve our purposes, right? And the entire idea of the middle class in the labor market is a result of scientific reasoning that we taught to everybody. I think we need to do that in the economy. By teaching entrepreneurial reasoning, effectual reasoning to people, I believe we can build the middle class of business. So entrepreneurship need not be only about self-employment, just getting a whole bunch of people to start something. That's why we put a lot of energy on in policy and we put money on it, or we put a lot of private money like making the billion-dollar unicorns, right? I think the real economy has to be in the middle. There are many companies in the US, for example, that currently are 200K companies that can grow to at least $2 million. And there are $2 million companies. If we can take even 5% of them and convert them and teach them how to make it into a $20 million company, all our economic problems will be solved. So I really think what Effectual Reason is useful for is to build that middle class of business and allow the ones that can become unicorns to become unicorns, and also allow those people who kind of want to do their thing, they can do their thing as well. But the idea is the entire economy, the entire society gets educated in thinking like an entrepreneur, and therefore they can help nurture entrepreneurs.
All right, I'm going to let you talk about the other side of the coin for a moment. I've heard you say, you use this expression, keep failure small and useful.
Yeah.
What part does failure play in the effectuation process, and kind of like how do you know when party's over and you need to turn the lights out?
Okay. Remember that the first thing that effectuation gives you is it gives you control over the downside. So you can decide before you even start the venture what failure would look like and can you live with it, right? So you can say something like, I am willing to give this, 6 months of nights and weekends, and I'm willing to give it $30,000 from my savings. Or you can say, I'm willing to take a 1 year, break or a sabbatical from my job. I'm going to leave my job. I'm going to do this for a year because my spouse is willing to support me. And then at the end of the year, I'll be back on the job market if I don't succeed. So you get to choose what the conditions are, at which point in time you're going to say, okay, I'm done. And you try to go back to something else. So the first idea in effectuation is that you get to decide what failure is. But the interesting thing about deciding and pre-committing to your affordable loss is it also allows you to choose your ventures, the stuff that you work on, differently. Because you have to choose ventures that are worth doing even if you fail, right? So failure is kind of designed into the system from day one, because failure is about controlling the downside. It's not about something unexpected that happens and you fail. You kind of have a definition of failure to begin with. And now when you get started and start doing this thing, you're going to fail a lot, in the sense that almost every single day, right, you're coming up with things that you can do, and you're going and talking to people, and people self-select in. And as they self-select in and they are giving you some commitment, now their affordable loss gets joined in with your affordable loss. So slowly your affordable loss increases even before your profits or anything else can increase. So you can actually fail a lot. So failure is built into the system, into the process in the second way as well. In the sense that as you build, even if you fail, your ability to fail increases. Does that make any sense? Because especially when you start putting together the crazy quilt and there are other people who come on board. So the lessons that expert entrepreneurs have learned about failure and success is as follows, right? So some of them will expressly tell you this as well. They'll actually say, don't think about success and failure as a 0-1 option. Don't think about success with a capital S and failure with a capital F. What you really are going to do is you're going to have all these little successes and little failures that you're going to manage over time. So you only want to think in the plural, right? Failures. You're going to learn how to outlive failures and sometimes even leverage them, and how to accumulate successes, how to put little successes together so they become bigger successes than even you could have thought of. And it is that management of that process is a part of the effectual thinking idea here. And effectual action and effectual interaction. And so the final set of maxims or set of lessons that expert entrepreneurs learn can be summarized in a soundbite, right? First of all, it's failures in the plural. And what are the lessons? Keep them small, kill them young, don't fail alone. And based on the principles that I have mentioned to you, you can already see that all of those three ways of thinking about the failures are designed into the system. You're keeping your failure small by choosing your affordable loss. You're keeping killing them young by making sure that you're not making an investment, some big investment into something, placing a big bet and waiting for things to work out. Instead, you are always bringing other people on board, and a lot of the things that happen very quickly tell you what works, what doesn't work, and what else can you do, and what else can you do. So you can keep them young, and you never fail alone, because remember, day one you may be alone, but day two you have self-selected stakeholders with you. So when failure happens, everybody loses what they can afford to lose. So that's, I think, the briefest explanation of success and failure I can give you.
I don't know, man. These don't seem all that brief, but I certainly think they're informative. Look, I've talked to you. The questions that I've asked so far have been kind of like almost on the behalf of the founder, the entrepreneur. I'm going to ask you a couple more questions, kind of on my own behalf as an investor in these types of things. And sadly, as a causal thinker who wants to try to be more of an effectual logic user. The first question is, so within the effectual logic framework, and so we're always, trying to force entrepreneurs to innovate, to think different, to add on. Is there a way actually within the effectual logic framework for entrepreneurs to innovate, or not really?
So it depends on how you think about innovation. right? If you start out saying that I'm going to sit in this room and I'm going to come up with an idea nobody has ever thought of before, if that's your idea of innovation, a lot of experienced entrepreneurs will say that's probably a waste of time. In fact, it's very difficult, or if not impossible, to come up with something like that. And if you did come up with something like that, it's probably not a good idea. So the way they would think about innovation is something that is, again, designed into the process. It's built into the process and happens automatically. So this idea of intentional innovation versus innovation that is, inevitable in the process, if you will. So let me illustrate that by using an example that I've used many times before, right? So the iconic example of causal versus effectual thinking actually is in cooking, right? You can cook causally and you can cook effectually. In cooking causally, you first decide what you want to cook, and then you go out and get, like grandma's best possible recipe. Then you go and get the ingredients that the recipe calls for, make sure you have the utensils, and you make the dish. In effectual cooking, you just walk into the kitchen, you open the fridge, you look at the cupboards, you go out to the garden, you see what's around, and you start making something that you can make with it. In both causal thinking and in effectual thinking, causal cooking and effectual cooking, you have to know how to cook, right? The basics you still have to understand. If you're a bad cook, the dish will turn out badly whether you cook causally or effectually. But assume for a moment you're a good cook. Now, if you cook causally, you will probably get exactly what you set out to cook, and it will probably taste fantastic. When you cook effectually, there is a lot more uncertainty there, right? Because you might not have one or two ingredients, and you will improvise. And you may come up with something new that tastes fantastic. But you may also come up with something new that, it tastes okay. Or something happens, the smoke alarm goes off, and you run out of the kitchen and things get burnt or whatever. But what you can see in the process is, if you succeed when you're cooking effectually, you would automatically have come up with something new. Either because you didn't have the resources, or somebody unexpected became a self-selected stakeholder, and when you put your bird in hand and affordable loss together, it just turned out to be something different. So innovation is almost inevitable if you succeed. And if you fail, then your failures are going to be small. So the cost of failure is going to be lower in effectuation. So those are the two performance implications from effectuation. So when you think about innovation, right, you want to think about intentional innovation, and there are lots of different processes that you can use, but the effectual process is almost like innately innovative anyway. And on top of it, suppose you are a scientist or an inventor and you come up with something brand new to begin with, because that is part of your bird in hand. I can give you examples of those as well, right? If you're an inventor and you come up with something because it's part of your wheelhouse, it's part of your bird in hand, you can use the effectual principles to build that into an enduring company as well. The only thing is you don't want to fall in love too much with your idea so that you are not listening to other people. So you do want to think about building it effectually, even if you start with innovation as your first thought and aim in the venture creation process. But as I mentioned, there are no guarantees, but the probability that you will come up with something innovative, even in an uninnovative space, like grocery chains, right? Staples created a new category, a new market category in stationery and in department stores. And that kind of story happens all the time when you use effectuation. So it depends on what kind of innovation you're talking about and for what reason.
All right. So the other question that I have is you basically said earlier in the discussion that by using effectual logic, it doesn't guarantee that a founder will be a high performance entrepreneur. It might be or she might be a good entrepreneur, but not necessarily, the next Bill Gates. As an investor, how can I tell if an entrepreneur who employs effectual logic will likely be a high performance entrepreneur? Is there any things that I should look for?
So this is very interesting. I'm going to give two completely different, maybe even contradictory answers to this question. Okay. The first answer is, Steve, are you any good at predicting it causally now?
Well, of course, according to you, no.
Because I know the failure rate for people who get venture capital is like 9 out of 10. And we know from existing data on, in fact, a series of very good studies in recent years when you look at just the broader economy of everybody who starts a venture and how the ventures survive or not. We know the survival rate is actually 50%. And of the 50% that exist, a third of them are profitable at the time of exit. So when you look at that, I mean, I'm not sure we have any good way of predicting what the next unicorn will be or what the next multi-billion-dollar entrepreneur would be, for sure. But here's the contradiction that I'm going to tell you. Since in effectuation, the surest predictor of success is failure, right? So I can imagine an effectual investment firm that actually leverages both the principles of effectuation and thinks about what would a term sheet look like that actually uses an effectual process and actually looks at what the entrepreneur is doing and how are they making decisions, are they trying to predict, are they co-creating, what are the different ways they are minimizing prediction. So what you're going to do there though is not predict that this particular venture will be enormously successful, but you can predict that that particular entrepreneur is going to be enormously successful sooner or later if they just stick to it. Right? Because they can afford to fail a lot in the process and then come up with something. You can still not predict that it's going to be a unicorn. But here is the interesting part. With an investor on board as a self-selected stakeholder, scaling becomes so much easier. So when the effectual entrepreneur actually comes upon an idea that is scalable, the causal investor can come in and scale it like crazy, right? So if you have, Starbucks has built like 3, 5, 10 stores in the northwestern region, an investor can come in and now take them from say 10 stores to 300 to 3,500 stores in no time at all. And so the idea here is there are ways, I believe, to build an effectual investment portfolio. In fact, I want to share a little thought with you. One of the people that I have worked with a lot is Robert Wildbank, who came from the investment industry. And he studied angel investors. And he put together a course in Willamette University in Oregon where the students learn to invest using the principles of effectuation. And they are showing that it is possible to actually do very well. Again, very well may not be venture capital very well, right? It's not 600x or 60x or whatever it is you guys are shooting for. But it is way more profitable over the longer run than you might think. So I can imagine, in fact, it's a dream to think about what if I put together an effectual venture capital firm, what would that look like? That is something I'd like to think about. And if you want to think about it, I'm happy to work with you. But I think it is possible. But the way you have to think about it is you're going to invest in entrepreneurs, you're going to invest in an effectual process, an effectual entrepreneurial process, but also an effectual investment process. And I think over a period of time, the effectual entrepreneurs and the effectual investors together are going to actually be able to build the best unicorns you can imagine. And for me, unicorns are not just about multi-billion-dollar companies. For me, the $50 million, the $500 million company is also very interesting.
Well, I think this is something that I would like to do as long as I don't end up investing in paper companies. I just want to make sure that I...
This is one of the things I want to tell you, right? A lot of effectual entrepreneurs are like, why do I need a VC? So I don't think Mrs. Cheng ever had to take any VC money. So that's the other flip side of it. Like, you probably have to stand in line there for a bit.
I see. Well, but it sounds like you're telling me that, I have some use and that I can help these entrepreneurs scale once they get some critical mass. So I'm not...
Absolutely. And I think you can also identify them earlier on, and you can probably partly through the investment, but also partly through training or co-learning, if you will, you can create an effective process that becomes your deal flow. You see what I'm trying to say? I
do, and I like that part because that feels much more manageable to me.
Yeah. I think it's absolutely doable. I would love to see someone do it, even if whether I'm involved or not, I would love to see that actually happen.
All right. Well, I promise to put some more thought into you and come back. We're getting near the end here. Wanted to ask just a couple of things what particular sources should we send people to learn? I know you have effectuation.org. Is that a good source?
I think effectuation.org is the best source as of now. It was a site built primarily for academics and for researchers and educators. But over the years, a lot of materials have collected, videos, stories, exercises, all kinds of things have collected on the site that are useful for practitioners as well, for anybody and everybody who wants to use it. So I welcome you to check it out, and if there are other things you need from me, I can always send them to you as well. So that is the best source, and once you go there, not only do you have access to the materials on the site, but you will also find people that are doing this, whether it's entrepreneurs or educators or policymakers, and you might want to write to them and reach out to them as well. So that is the best site so far, although there are lots of interviews and other things that I have done with other organizations over time. There's also effectuation sites in other languages, like in German and Dutch and Bahasa, I believe. And so there are sources that people can go to, but effectuation.org, I think, is the starting point for it. There is one other website that I can recommend. I can recommend two, actually. One is called IKEN, IKEN. This is an organization in India that has developed a peer coaching program for effectuation. So it's some kind of like Toastmasters, where people meet once a week and they learn from each other with a little bit of facilitation from a more experienced entrepreneur. And that's a way to learn effectuation. And the blogs and the stories and the materials on that site might be very interesting to people. There's also another company, another organization called 100 Open Startups. This was started by Bruno Rondani in Brazil, who actually did his PhD in effectuation, believe it or not. But he also worked with a professor in Berkeley on the idea of open innovation. So he was really focused on bringing together open innovation and effectuation. And what 100 Open Startups does is they have a process through which they match up corporate partners with entrepreneurs. So entrepreneurs don't have to come for VC funding. They can actually pre-sell to a customer, literally, right? So Bruno has implemented that, and that is available, I think, in 63 countries or something, they told me last time. But then it's available in the US as well. So those are some sources that I would point to go and take a look. And if I am missing something somebody else has done, I'm just going to apologize to them in advance, because there's so much going on with effectuation now that I am not able to keep abreast of everything.
What about somebody taking your course at UVA?
So at UVA, we have the iLab, which is the incubator. It serves not only the Darden School, but also University of Virginia and the larger community in and around Charlottesville. And the iLab has created a program that is based on effectuation that is available to people. They're also creating a program to train mentors. So we can have more people. So, it's not only the educators who can come and train. Experienced entrepreneurs can use a curriculum to mentor startups as well. So I'm very glad you asked that. This is what I mean. I should have brought this up on my own. And there are a couple of people who are beginning to build effectual incubators, ideas of equity sharing between ventures and self-selection, and a whole training program that I can, keep you informed as they build them.
Do you announce any of this stuff on Twitter or any other social thing?
My life is so crazy at this point. I mean, remember when you're an academic, you don't sign up for this stuff. I am barely able to manage email. So I personally am not on any social media or anything. But my school is, and I think that is, there's an effectuation Twitter handle that which is escaping me at this point in time. But I can put you in touch with people. And remember, there's a large community out there. So there's an organization in Europe that does consulting and training of trainers. So there are lots of people who are on social media with effectuation, but not me.
Okay, so
the only way to reach me is saras@virginia.edu.
Oh, okay. Now we're talking. Okay, this is the end. Is there anything else that you'd like to add before we close up?
No, I can't think of anything. As I said, my brain is not really running on all cylinders.
Okay. Yes.
You remember something always, call
Yes. All right, let's end here. Thanks so much. I appreciate your time. Obviously, your insight is immeasurably invaluable to the people that are listening. It's really helpful. Thanks.
Thank you, Steve.
This has been Intangibles, a podcast created by Antecedent Ventures. Find out more at www.antecedent.vc. I'd like to thank Denton's Venture Technology Group at dentonsventurebeyond.com for being the sponsor this season and a supportive partner. Operating as a boutique within the world's largest law firm, the Venture Technology Group runs with hard-charging tech entrepreneurs to drive growth through strategic business, finance, and legal advice, from Silicon Valley and New York to London, Berlin, Hong Kong, and beyond. Learn more at dentonsventurebeyond.com. I'd also like to thank Ben Glowy, who's been instrumental in helping me record and produce this season. I couldn't have done it without him. Find him on Twitter at visible_sound. And thank you. Keep an eye out for the next episode, and if you like this one, leave us a favorable review. I'm your host, Steve Berg.